Hello, and a happy anniversary, Gillingham Baptist Church. My name is Paul Wintle. You might see my name in the prayer directory more than you see me in person. And that's because over 3 years ago, I became the pastor of a small but wonderful community, Main Street Community Church in Cheshire. Before that, I was on the leadership team at Green Street. I always thought that if one was invited to speak at the church anniversary weekend, one had made it. And so here we are, celebrating God's faithfulness to us as a fellowship here at Green Street over these years. The church at Green Street has had its building since 1888. The building which houses the congregation at which I pastor has been in existence since 1872, firstly as an Anglican chapel, and then more recently as an independent fellowship, working closely with other churches in our town. Like every other place of worship across our land, we've been unable to visit our buildings to gather together. As you all know, we've had to become church in totally different ways, and the building, yes, even the beautiful new look Gillingham Baptist Church with its interesting sounding chairs, is presently superfluous. Who'd have thought that could ever be? And yet here we are. Are we the church without the building? As we celebrate this church anniversary, I'd like us to look at the book of Haggai. There isn't enough time for me to read this whole book today, even though it's only 2 chapters, but you might want to skim read it as I speak. Only 38 verses in length, this minor prophet offers us examples of what occurs to the people of God following their exile into their new world. For a number of years in the 6th century BC, the people of God, the Jews, had been kidnapped by the Babylonian Empire. And now, under a new scheme, many were being allowed back home. And one of the most important things back then was to ensure the temple where God lived was rebuilt. Haggai's message was primarily to remind the people to do this task. But as we shall see, the temple was never the important thing. And even if people obey, there are promises that are made about God always being there, about God shaking the earth. I think we can agree that our lives, our jobs, our whole way of living, and our whole way of dying are being shaken. So let me introduce to you Zerubbabel and Joshua, the movers and shakers in the book of Haggai, to rebuild the temple. The people had built their own homes as well as an altar to God, but hadn't finished the job of building the whole temple. Only a remnant, just a few people who would perhaps be verging on their 90th birthdays, would remember the splendor of what we now know as Solomon's temple. And so the work of the Lord, the word of the Lord, comes to God's people, and they listen and get on with the work. They rebuild the temple, and so their faith is so full of promise and full of community. Even the remnant that complained that the new temple won't be as good as the previous one are stopped in their tracks. God promises that the future glory of the temple will be greater than its past glory. This is God renewing his promise never to leave his people, a covenant where relationship between God and people is central to everything. That's why Haggai repeats God's promise, I am with you, because the temple had been the place where God had resided. And so when it was destroyed in 587 BC and the Jews were taken into exile by the Babylonians, history seemed to say to them, your God's got nowhere to live now. Where is your God? He's nowhere, so you belong to us now, the Babylonians. The remnant who are now back in Jerusalem have a promise that their God is still with them, despite the destruction of the temple. God speaks through Haggai 3 times to say, give careful thought to your ways. It's not so much a warning of how to live, rather than to interpret the Hebrew, to set your heart on your ways. That is, to have a purpose, and to set everything you have in living accordance with that purpose. So set your heart on your ways. Why? Because a holy God desires a holy people. He wants to be with them. He wants to be in relationship with them. In spite of their forgetfulness of not having rebuilt the temple, as we shall find out, the building is not important. The relationship is. Perhaps we are still finding out that for ourselves in these worrying, tricky times, that God is still with us. He is with us beyond the buildings. When the prophecy of the new temple being more glorious than the old one comes, God knows that he's talking about the Messiah Jesus in the future. But before then, Zerubbabel, mentioned here in Haggai, is a forerunner to Jesus as one who is close to God. And also ends up being in the line of Jesus' forebears. When the prophecy of the new temple is being more glorious than the old one, God knows. God knows. So perhaps the prophecy of Haggai is a little bit about people's priorities and the closeness of a nation's relationship with God. And yes, perhaps we can take something away from that. We can set our hearts on God's ways. We can obey. We can know that God is still with us. Because for the people of God who are rebuilding the temple, that's what it was partly about. God's visible presence through that temple. And yet, I wonder whether we're still missing something. Something else that we're missing from this story. Something that mentioned 3 times in these 38 verses, that God will shake his people. Remodeling a building to the glory of God is one thing. But what then? Is the building itself the end result? What was the plan for the temple? Hindsight and history tell us that this rebuilt temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. But it doesn't mean that God had left the people. Remodeling of God's people took place in their hearts. There was no need for a temple anymore. Following the resurrection of Jesus and before the destruction of the temple, the Holy Spirit descended upon God's people who were gathered in an upstairs room. This was something new. The Holy Spirit in people rather than God residing in a building. This was something new, perhaps unexpected by many onlookers, and yet predicted by Jesus to his close followers at his resurrection. No longer was God only for the prophetic. No longer was God only for the special ones, for each one is special. Each one is loved by God. Each one has the seal of God written on them and in them. Each one is made in the image of the Creator God. No longer was a temple required to make sacrifices, for that ultimate sacrifice in the death and resurrection of Jesus had been made so that humanity could have a restored relationship with its Creator once again. Once, for all, forever. It isn't that the rebuilding of the temple for Haggai's contemporaries was unimportant, but the plan was always for God to have his home amongst and within his people, not a building. Buildings can't represent God in the way that people can. Buildings aren't alive in the same way that people are alive. Whilst people might have some form of relationship with the architecture around them, and whilst they might be moved by the wonder of something made by human hands, it was always the plan that God lived in relationship with people. For the remnant, those returning after 70 years in exile, it could never be as good as it used to be. And memories are often coloured with history and hindsight, those good old halcyon days. But what if God had other plans? 25 years ago at Main Street Community Church, the church where I serve, we had to literally move our building. It was literally lifted up on car jacks and winched by hand 12 feet to now where it now sits on a new foundation. At the same time, a new worship area was created, so there's now a hall in the former chapel and a new worship area slotted on to the back. Apparently it's about the same size or same length as the temple. This took vision. God shook his people to action. He shook the congregation to action in order to bring about what we have now. But now, so what? Are we sitting back on our laurels in our panelled houses, as I might say, having completed one job? Or is there something else? Are we there yet? And if not, why are we sitting back? What is God showing us now at Main Street, but also at Green Street? What are we becoming in the light of these buildings, and perhaps more importantly, in the light of the congregation? Our relationships, us discovering again and again how we are being changed and transformed to serving a great God. How is God shaking us today? Is it about how we treat and use our buildings? I think it's got to be more than that, because it's always about community, our fellowship and those relationships, which includes God's mission to go to the world, to make disciples. Staying in a building doesn't make disciples. It keeps people inside. So how is God shaking us out of our buildings? I can tell you I've been shaken a lot lately. The congregation I serve has lost 4 members in 3 months. These losses have shaken us as a community, and now we're apart because of the coronavirus, just when we need one another to be there. And yet, through modern technology, and through older technology as well, letter writing, the phone, we can still, in some meaningful way, be together. And we can be on mission as well, doing a shop, sharing some online school resources, or listen to someone who's worried. None of this takes the building, but sometimes it shakes us for us to be moved out of our comfort zones. I wonder if that's something that resonates with you. Something in your life, something in your life together. I know I need my church family. I need them to walk with. And I'm blessed that I can serve in a variety of ways even now, picking up some medication or doing a shop for somebody isolating at home. This is mission, because only when we are shaken together do we sometimes realize that God is still with us, that we can give careful thought to our ways and be reminded of why it was that God brought us here to share a common life. Before this coronavirus really hit, a friend of mine reflected through Facebook, through Lent on Facebook. She talked about how disruption is often seen as a bad thing, when maybe we ought to look more deeply into it. And this is what she said. I quite like rhythm, and I quite like patterns. I like things that have a flow and that make sense. I like life to feel like that. But I also know that when that goes on for too long, I stagnate. I stop changing and growing and transforming. I basically stop. So every year during Lent, I deliberately disrupt my rhythm so that it becomes a little broken, and I intentionally cut across what has become a pattern, so there is an element of chaos and mess. And it's in this chaos and mess that something new is able to emerge. I've noticed that most people don't like disruption. We might say we do, but when push comes to shove, we really actually don't. We like it when it happens to other people, but not to us, not so much. When that happens, it's seen as a fault that needs fixing. Can you see how this is all so tricky? But what if disruption is exactly what we need? What happens if it is where a new path is set and a new way of being is discovered? Today, may we embrace the disruption. May we be challenged. May we also not be afraid. After all, it's the beginning of something new. So, Gillingham Baptist Church, happy anniversary. May you look back with gratitude for all God has done through the building and through its people over the years. And may you look forward to what plans are ahead those you are already excited about, and those that you're fearful of, and those to be made known. May you know that God is with you, and may you, through this period of shaking, set your heart on his ways. May God bless you.